Welcome and thank you for joining us on your Tuesday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I'm here in New York. And Havenly is really excited to offer this free class today on how to style your space like a designer. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Shelby Gerard. I'm the VP of Creative and Design at Havenly. And in case you don't know, Havenly is an online interior design company that was founded from the belief that everyone deserves a home they feel good in at any budget. And it's in that very spirit that I'm teaching this class tonight for free. So whether you have an eye for design or are just, passionate about how your space looks and how it feels, or if you have no clue what you're doing at all, this class is really just meant to provide some inside tips and guidance on what to think about to start to improve the design of your space. I know we're all spending a lot of time at home right now. So I've certainly been thinking about my space in new ways and using it in new ways and just kind of analyzing every little corner. So I think it's a good time to really invest some time in making things a little more beautiful and delightful in small ways. So we're going to go ahead and get started. On the agenda for the next half hour, we're going to cover some interior design styles and talk a bit about how to identify your unique style. I'll go over some design fundamentals, so a few key components to think about when designing a space. And then I'll talk about real life styling and practice. So I'm going to show you a few things in my own home, in my living room, to demonstrate how these principles come to life in an actual space. And then I'll leave you with a few tips on design elements that I think every great space should have. And again, I'll show you some examples of those in my own home. Feel free to use the chat feature, and we can kind of go over any questions you guys have at the end as time allows. Okay, so jumping right into interior design styles and how you can start to identify your own. Auditing your closet is always a great place to start. So I often find that my clients' personal fashion sense is actually really aligned with their interior design style as well. So your wardrobe can kind of give you some cues around what your preferences are when it comes to, color and pattern, or how formal or informal you are, whether you're more classic or you're more trendy. So look at your closet and, if it's filled with like floral maxi dresses, maybe your design style leans a little more bohemian and relaxed and free-spirited. If you have ruffles or sequins or animal prints, you're probably a little more luxe or glam in your home decor style. So think like furs and velvets or brass accents. If in your closet you have a lot of neutrals or perhaps like stripes, tailored button-ups, you probably lean a little more classic and would prefer a more kind of timeless and refined space. So there are really countless interior design styles, and some come and go in popularity over the years. You might remember shabby chic, for example. My mother was very into shabby chic in the 90s, but that isn't really so talked about anymore. So from Havenly's experience, working with thousands of clients, we've sort of identified some of the most popular styles right now to give you guys a sense of where you might fall on the spectrum. And honestly, we could, I could teach a class on each of these and how to bring them to life. So I'm just going to touch on a few key components so that you can start, thinking about which one sounds like me. And also note that you're probably a mix of a couple of things, and I think that's what makes this space really unique. So on the spectrum from kind of modern to classic, starting with modern, this style includes clean lines, simple silhouettes, often a simple palette, so black and white, maybe bold pops of color. And I would say this is often paired with another style. So for example, you might be modern farmhouse or modern glam. And then moving into luxe style, which is often also kind of referred to as glam, although for some reason glam gets a bad rap. This is more, elegant sculptural details, rich fabrics like velvets, furs, and then some statement making accents. So perhaps a leopard print pillow or an ornate gilded floor mirror, for example. And then moving down, eclectic is sort of a harmonious blend of styles and different eras for a really collected look, kind of a storied traveled look. A version of eclectic that we're seeing a lot right now is bohemian design. It's really popular, and that sort of mixes a lot of different patterns, textures, materials for a really layered space. Cali Cool is definitely a trending style, I think made popular by some famous design accounts like Studio McGee or Amber Interiors. And it uses a lot of organic textures, cooler tones, usually blues and greens. It's a little more relaxed in nature, and it also sometimes has that kind of bohemian touch to it. I would say this is sort of the new version of coastal we're seeing. So like I'm seeing less Cape Cod, nautical coastal, and more relaxed Pacific, you know, West Coast coastal. Scandinavian is also very popular, and it's all about simplicity, neutral tones, lots of grays and whites, cozy textures, and really simple kind of modern silhouettes. Farmhouse was really, you know, made into a household name by fixer-upper and Joanna Gaines. It's all about cozy, warm spaces that speak more to traditional elements, I would say. So in terms of materials, think like jute, you know, buffalo check patterns, linen, rustic wood, maybe mason jars, if you're really going farmhouse. And then classic is your more timeless design. So often neutral color palette, blue and white is a really classic palette as well, and more kind of tailored and traditional furniture pieces. So with that all, you know, being outlined and said, the best spaces I think really do blend styles for an interesting, layered, and personal look. That's what kind of makes a space a little less cookie cutter and a little less conventional. So you want your space to really feel like you. And so whatever, you know, you relate to on that design spectrum, I would say blend them up, and that's probably your style. So here's a couple examples of spaces that do kind of blend various styles. This space is really classic in its symmetry, and it has some traditional elements like the porcelain blue and white vases, some antique paintings, the vintage looking rug feels more traditional, and then it has some modern too, in the bold patterns of the pillows, the bolder blue sofas, that burlwood coffee table is really pretty contemporary as well. And then it also has some luxe touches like the gold in the side table and the mirror, and a bit of fur and velvets as well in the pillows. And then this space is, you know, modern farmhouse with a touch of Scandi. So it's modern with very clean lines of the furniture, really simple lighting, and there's definitely some farmhouse coming in with like the shiplap on the fireplace wall, the wooden chairs feel farmhouse, and then even a bit of that kind of industrial nature of the pendant light. And then the Scandinavian comes through in like the white and black simple color palette, and just the general kind of sense of coziness and warmth to the space. All right, so once you've kind of identified your personal design style, there are a handful of rules that we designers follow when creating a space. These are the ones we think about the most, I would say, that I'll walk through today, but there are others as well. So I'm going to talk about what palette, contrast scale, symmetry, and layering mean when it comes to design, and how those translate in the space. Oh, and before I do that, I will mention that the beauty in designing a space, I think, is knowing the rules and then breaking the rules. So, you know, where you break them and how you break them kind of depends on your personal vibe and how classic you might be, but keep that in mind as we go through these. So the first step in any kind of design process is really establishing the tone of the space, and starting with a palette is an easy way to approach that. So an easy place to start is with a color you love. Let's say blue in the example of this space. And then sort of like coloring your hair, you want to add dimension through highlights and lowlights. So colors that kind of lift and brighten, like ivories and whites or lighter blue tones in the space, and then the warmer tones kind of add depth and dimension. So like the blushes and terracottas in this space add a little bit more dimension. And then keep in mind that it's not only color that kind of makes up your palette, but texture and the materials you use as well. So here the marble table really brightens up the space. It adds kind of this formal luxe touch. And then the distressed wood of the shelves on the wall add this natural warmth to the palette as well. And some spaces, you know, might only have like cooler tones, blues and greens. Some spaces might really rely on warmer tones, which are like reds, oranges, yellows. This space, I think, does a great job of blending both really well, which creates a sense of balance and just kind of lets your eye move around from piece to piece. So some other examples of popular palettes in interior design. This is perhaps my personal favorite, which you'll see when I show you my living room. All neutrals, so a mix of ivories, beiges, whites, off-white, soft gray. Light blue here is added for just the softest pop of color. This kind of makes for a space that's just really calming, serene, spa-like. And then we have a high contrast palette, which is also really popular, blacks and whites. In this space, you know, it's mostly neutral, but I think the deep saturated colors of the rug, the olive, there's a little olive and navy and rust in there, makes it feel a little more classic and sophisticated. Pastels is another popular one. So the overall palette of this space, I think because it's neutral, it still feels a little more adult, even though we're using pastels, and we're using them in a pretty sparse way. So just in the bed, a little bit of the wallpaper and the accents on the bed as well. And this is just a really nice, soft, you know, slightly more feminine vibe. So in this space, I used actually a very high contrast palette to start, of black and white, which leans more contemporary usually, and then woven some earthier tones. So the green is actually a very earthy green. There's a few warm tones in here with the pillow, the leather chair cushion, even the brass pendant really adds warmth and creates this kind of organic, earthy feel. Jewel tones is a great option for more luxe, kind of a bold, dramatic look. So blacks, you know, deep, rich teals, vibrant fuchsias, set this kind of glam tone. And here too, I think there's a little breathing room that comes in with the gray wallpaper and the white curtains. It helps just kind of soften things up, but overall the vibe is really moody. And then lastly, another option, if you're not afraid of color, you know, do a bold accent wall and mix lots of vibrant primary colors for a playful and kind of more energetic space. I think when using a lot of color, I always recommend keeping some neutrals and whites, especially in the walls. I think it really helps to just let the colors pop and not have things feel overwhelming or too busy. So moving on to contrast, this is one of my personal go-to design moves in a space, and we often think of contrast, you know, in color. I think that's the first and most obvious place where we think of contrast, but there's other ways to create contrast as well. So, you know, black and white is one of my favorite color palettes, and just juxtaposing those two tones can really activate a space, make it pop. And you can obviously do this with other tones as well. So like a blush and emerald green is high contrast, but might make a space feel a little more feminine or glam. Navy or like a seafoam and white is a really more classic kind of high contrast color palette as well. You can also create contrast with pattern, and pillows are always a good example of when to do this. So if you're mixing patterns, you want to create contrast through mixing linear and more regular patterns like stripes with more organic, kind of free-flowing patterns like a botanical, for example. And you also want to think about contrasting the scale of your pattern. So mixing a busier, like small scale pattern, this animal print is a good example, with a larger scale pattern like the palm botanical pillow or that stripe even. So there's kind of balance in the weight of the patterns as well. And one of the ways designers use contrast really well, I think that's not quite so easily learned, is to mix styles and bring in pieces from different eras. So here you can see this is actually my old living room. We have this traditional oil painting that my grandfather painted of my grandmother, which feels very classic. This bust, which also kind of nods to a classic aesthetic. And then a more modern coffee table, streamlined, you know, this pedestal table in the corner is really modern and streamlined. The rug is like a little more global, Moroccan, and then I had some mid-century pieces as well. So the lamp has a very mid-century silhouette, as well as the armchair. So it's kind of kept cohesive through the color palette being really simple, and the finishes used are cohesive as well. But it shows that mixing styles can really feel artful and make a space more unique. And then texture is really important in more neutral spaces, especially I would say, where there may not be a lot of contrasting colors. And it's a great way to make your space feel warm and cozy. So this space uses a lot of different textures in the textiles. You can see contrast in the knits next to leather, next to linen. And then a really kind of textural basket on the wall juxtaposed with the smooth wood coffee table. And you'll see in my own living room, I've kind of broken the rule of contrast in color as well and used more texture and monochromatic contrast. And then lastly, shape. As a rule of thumb, we want to mix, round, streamlined, sculptural, and organic shapes all in the same space. So this is my dining room that I'm sitting in right now. And to me, it'd be less interesting if it had a round table, on top of a round rug with a spherical pendant light above it and maybe a circular, pedestal table in the corner. I think it works better because the rug is this organic, irregular shape, and the table and the bookcase have some contrast in their shape as well. And then the chandelier is sort of this wild card kind of sculptural element that breaks the rule as well. So lots of ways to add contrast. Scale is also super important when designing a space. And I'd argue this is one of the things that really helps to have a professional involved for. Sometimes it's just hard to lay things out without kind of some experience in a floor plan to see how things will properly fill your room. But I think this room is a good example of using scale correctly on a few levels. So first, it's a pretty large space and it has an adequate amount of furniture to really help fill the room. So a common mistake I see is, just a small sofa in a really large room or a really small rug in a really large room. The furniture is selected at a scale that really helps fill the space here. Secondly, I commonly see spaces where, the rug just feels lost in the room because it's too small, or someone has this big blank wall and then like a tiny piece of artwork or curtains that are off the floor and just too small for the space. So I think this room captures how scaling those pieces to the size of your space really helps just create a cohesive and kind of finished, refined effect. As a general rule, I think since rugs are so hard, if you have a really large room, just think bigger than you're probably thinking. So like a 9 by 12, for example, for a really large space, an 8 by 10, generally you're going to want an 8 by 10 for living rooms or bedrooms. And then just think, you want the front furniture legs on the rug at least. So the front legs of your sofa and your chair should sit on that rug so it doesn't feel like a floating island in the room. Symmetry is one of those rules that I think is kind of important to learn and then break it as well in certain moments. So it's sort of foolproof, to do parallel sofas or matching nightstands, matching lamps. And this room kind of demonstrates how symmetry works really well. I think what makes this space more interesting though is that the rule isn't followed everywhere. So the pillows are different on each side of the sofa, which makes it a little less formal or stuffy feeling. And the mantle and the artwork also plays with asymmetry, which I think adds just a little more interest and a more personal and collected look. And then lastly, layering. So we think about this a lot as well when designing. This can translate in a number of ways. Mainly and most obviously is probably layering textiles. So this can create a really luxe and cozy feel. There's also dimensional layering here. So you can think of this as like playing with the plane of your space and coming off the wall. So here the baskets and the wall sconces create this layered effect that provide a lot of dimension to the room. And then, another way I love to implement layering is literally like layering artwork one over the other. I can show you an example of that in a bit. Or layering rugs. So putting a hide on top of a jute rug, or if you have like a beautiful vintage rug that feels too small for a space, putting it on top of a 8 by 10 or a 9 by 12 jute rug is a great way to use that rug, but fill your space and create that nice layered effect. So now I am going to stop sharing my screen and switch over to my laptop here. And show you around my living room a little bit to talk about putting some of these principles into practice. Give me 1 second. Okay, hoping you guys can still hear me. And so here's my living room. I'm just gonna try to not make you guys super dizzy, but show you some things. This view tends to be super blown out, so maybe I'll come over here and just kind of talk about some of the things I just went over and how they can come to life in a real space. So personal style, you know, my style evolves, I would say, like every 6 months. I change direction a lot. Right now, I would say I'm kind of going with like a warm minimalism vibe. And when we talk about blending styles, one constant for me, regardless of like what current trend I'm on, is that I love mixing modern pieces alongside vintage or more traditional furniture. So in this space, I've done that. You can see I have a really modern side chair that has this really mid-century silhouette, some side tables that are very streamlined and modern, another chair that's a little bit funkier and modern, and then I have this floor mirror that's more kind of European and traditional, as well as a slip-covered sofa, and this Chesterfield style sofa, which is a normally pretty traditional silhouette. It's modernized a little bit with the shape of that one, but that's how I kind of like to blend eras regardless of the specific style I'm going for. I also have this kind of sloped lampshade, which is a more traditional element, alongside some pretty modern side tables. And then I talked about palette and contrast a little bit and alluded to the fact that I'm pro, you know, neutral palette personally. I love using color for clients. I just, in my own space, I find it calming to use all neutrals. So I've used kind of a mix of ivories, whites, and relied on contrast and texture to create some depth and dimension. So in my space, brass actually acts as a warmer accent color. So I have a brass pendant here. Some of the lighting has some brass accents in it, and that really kind of helps warm up my space. And then I do have a few hints of black in my art frames, some books, the wood of a side chair, so that provides contrast as well. And then really I just have more textural contrast in the types of fabrics and materials and the mix of like linens with wood. I have travertine coffee tables. So I've just mixed kind of lots of different natural materials with more modern pieces like these white lacquer kind of console tables are much more modern. And then in terms of scale, there are a few elements that I think in this room kind of help fill the space and also make it feel more dramatic or larger than it even is. So the first being the curtains. So I hung my curtains, I'm sorry, this is harder to see, but floor to ceiling here. And doing that really kind of makes your space feel taller and your windows feel larger. So one tip to take away is kind of think high and wide when it comes to hanging your curtains to make your space feel a little bit larger. Another example of scale in this room is this artwork that's very large and kind of oversized. It takes up almost this whole wall. But even if your space is small, this room, I live in New York in an 850 square foot apartment. This is not the biggest room. But larger pieces of furniture can almost make it feel more luxurious and grand. Similar to this floor mirror, it's actually quite large for the space. And even this pendant, you might think this is like a 36-inch diameter pendant. So that kind of thing might scare you off, but I think it actually can really benefit smaller spaces sometimes. And then lastly, my rug is actually a very abnormal size. It's very long. You can see it actually unites like both sides of this long, narrow room. So that's just an example of how a rug can really play to scale. And this one, most, you know, custom sizes are 8 by 10, 9 by 12. I had to go on Etsy to find a long, narrow rug because I wanted to really unite both ends of this room. Okay, and then I'm going to leave you guys with some designer tips when it comes to, like, if nothing else, what are the things I should start to think about in my own home? So I have 3 categories of things that I think make a space really feel well designed. The first is lighting. So I have a lot of clients who say, you know, oh, I don't need table lamps. I have can lights or I have recessed lighting.
I don't, you know, they think functionally, I don't need any more lighting. I would argue that you do. And my rule is kind of lighting in each corner of the space. So in a medium-sized room, think at least 3 sources of light. I have this art lamp here, which is the only light on this wall, and it's a really nice dim light it's great to have on at night if you're just having a glass of wine in the living room. We rent this space and there were ceiling fans everywhere. We put in this large overhead pendant light, which I actually don't even use that frequently because I prefer kind of ambient lighting. But even if you rent, that's generally an option to replace those overhead lights. So that's another source. And then in each corner on this side, I have a couple table lamps. So, you know, think about what you want your lighting level to be when you're hosting people, when you're reading a book at night, when you're listening to a record, when you're drinking wine. And it's probably not your overhead can lights, just having lights in each corner, and especially being able to dim them too, can really create a different mood. So lighting's number 1. My second kind of rule is artwork. I think it doesn't have to be expensive, but every space needs some artwork. It's what makes it personal and unique. So we've actually DIY'd a lot of our artwork just because it's affordable. And I have some pieces from, you know, my family. So like I said, it doesn't have to be pricey, and you don't have to put it on every wall. On this wall, you can see I intentionally kind of left that middle section blank and have just some more casually layered pieces here. But you got to have something personal on your walls, I would say. So lighting and artwork. And the last one is textiles. So if you're, you know, more eclectic, bohemian, this might be like layering lots of pillows. For me, it's really the rug and the curtains and more minimal kind of pillows and throws. So I think the large rug, the floor to ceiling curtains will help make any space feel more refined and just like you thought of every detail and it has that real designer touch. So if nothing else, when you're thinking about your space, think about your lighting, your textiles, and artwork. So that kind of wraps things up. Let me just check here the chat and this Q&A feature. So there's a question that came in, how much do you like to purchase pieces that are new versus antique and used? Good question. I personally love a mix. I do tend to have a style that naturally I like to mix modern with kind of older and ornate pieces. But I think it's those pieces you've picked up traveling or you find in a thrift store or an antique store that tell a story and make your space feel unique. So, you know, they're often the pieces too you start with. Like I have this old hand-me-down from my grandmother, this leather chair, and that kind of can create the palette for the rest of your space. So I don't think it has to be like 50-50 or anything, but having, you know, 2 to 3 pieces in every room, even if it's just like, I have this little vintage, it's like an ashtray that I put a couple crystals in. It's the smallest piece, but there's a little story behind it and it just doesn't feel new. So it adds a little dimension to the space. So maybe 2 to 3 pieces in each room, but it could be anything from furniture to small decor. If there are any other questions, feel free to write in. I think that's all I'm seeing right now. And I guess I did good on timing because we're right at 6:30. So I think this will be this is recorded. I'll have to check how we're following up. I know we're going to send everyone an email and we're going to have a code for a Havenly design package. So TBD on whether this presentation will be emailed as well, but we'll follow up with everyone in this group. And the code we'll follow up with, which I'll actually put in chat as well here, is going to be for $20 off a full design package and $10 off the Havenly mini design package. So hopefully we've given you some tips that you can implement yourselves, but professionals are great. And, you know, there's a lot to design and a lot of skill to it. So if you're looking for more comprehensive help, I would definitely recommend using one of the Havenly design packages. I'm posting the code in chat, but we'll also send it in an email to everyone here. And then I see one more question came through, which I'll answer before we leave. So how do you make your house feel cohesive when you feel drawn to conflicting palettes? I always do neutral, but I love the look of mixing colors and pattern. That's a good question. That's why I change my style every 6 months, I think, because I can't pick a lane. I can't decide. I'm always like, I like too many things. My dream is just to have like 10 houses so they can all have different styles, but it's not very realistic. So I would say, you know, choose something that unites your rooms. So maybe you have like a modern string through everything, but one room is a little more like moody, masculine, modern. One room's a little more eclectic, modern. But maybe your actual furniture pieces are pretty neutral and streamlined. And then in each space you play with like pattern and color. I think it'll just make your whole house feel like a singular house though. And then like you're having a little fun in each space. So I would say make sure there's a common element. But you can certainly change from room to room. It helps if you don't have like a big open floor plan where you see everything at once. But I would say powder rooms are really fun places. They're good places to have fun. So doing like a bold wallpaper or a crazy tile or something. And bedrooms and offices as well. I think you can have a little more fun since those are usually more enclosed singular spaces. How do you make a room with a TV look nicer? I actually used to have a TV here and we moved it recently, but when we did have a TV there, I had hung a gallery wall all around it. So it kind of just blended in the TV a little bit and made it feel like a piece of art. There is a fairly expensive TV from Samsung called The Frame that looks like a piece of art. I haven't splurged for that yet, but it's really beautiful, and it does it has a nice frame around it. It looks like a piece of art, but I always love the trick of hanging a gallery wall around your TV or even behind your TV if it's not even mounted on the wall. I also think if you like darker colors and like accent walls, doing the wall where your TV is like a dark navy or even a black or a darker color also just kind of helps disguise it, and it doesn't feel like a big black box in the room. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you guys so much for spending your Tuesday afternoon or evening with me. And stay tuned for the email we'll be sending shortly with the code for, like I said, $20 off the Havenly Full, $10 off the Havenly Mini. And I hope you guys enjoyed this class. And the other thing I'll say is follow Havenly on Instagram if you want more design inspiration. We're at the Havenly, and we post a lot of advice and content around these topics that I discussed tonight. So thank you guys. Have a good night.